Joe Harris only meant to empty one last trash can before going home to his daughter. Instead, he opened the CEO's office and saw the one secret powerful men would destroy her, to expose. A body hidden beneath a spinal brace, bruises she couldn't afford anyone to see, and a single glance that tied his fate to hers forever. 24 hours later, the woman he thought would fire him made an offer that would change his life, but accepting it meant stepping into a corporate war where one mistake could cost them both everything. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. Joe Harris's knee started aching around 6 o'clock, right on schedule, the same dull throb that had followed him home from Afghanistan and never once considered leaving. He shifted his weight off it and kept pushing the cart down the 41st floor hallway, the evening sky still holding onto its light outside the windows, gray and heavy the way it got before a storm that never quite arrived. Long legs, tired eyes, a dark uniform with his name stitched crooked over the pocket because the embroidery machine at the supply company had jammed halfway through his order and nobody ever fixed it. His badge swung against his chest every time he leaned into the cart. 2 hours into his shift. 6 more to go. He didn't mind the early start on evenings like this one, when most of the floor cleared out before the sky finished going dark. 3 years cleaning Titan Dynamics headquarters had taught him that the building emptied in stages. First the assistants, then the mid-level directors, checking their phones the whole walk to the elevator. Then, eventually, whoever was left at the top, the ones who stayed until the windows turned the color of the water downtown. He emptied a trash can outside the marketing suite, tied off the bag, and thought about Mia. She'd be home from school by now, probably at the kitchen table finishing homework she'd insist she already finished. Mrs. Okafor next door would look in on her twice before Joe made it back, waving off his attempts to pay her with anything more than the blueberry muffins Mia insisted on baking every other Sunday. 8 years old and already fixing her backpack strap with dental floss because she didn't want him spending money on a new one, already telling her teacher that her daddy worked upstairs at a very important building, without knowing that upstairs, to the people who actually mattered in that building, Joe didn't exist at all. He kept a picture of her taped inside his locker downstairs, the two of them at the county fair last summer, her front tooth missing, his arms slung around her shoulders like he could shield her from anything the world might throw. Some nights on his break, he'd stand there a full minute just looking at it before he went back out to finish his rounds. It reminded him why his knee didn't matter, why the long shifts didn't matter, why none of it mattered as long as she kept believing her father could fix anything that broke. That was the whole plan. Keep his head down, do good work, get home. The radio on his hip crackled. "Harris, you still on 41? He clicked it. "Yeah, just finishing up. Can you swing by the executive suite before you head down? Marisol's kid got sick. She left early." Nobody hit those offices tonight. Joe checked the time on his phone. Not even 7:30. He'd never once been asked to clean the executive floor. Different crew handled that wing. Different badge access. Different rules nobody explained to men like him, because nobody expected they'd need to know. "Yeah," he said. "I got it." The elevator ride up felt different than it should have for 4 floors. The doors opened onto a hallway with better carpet than his apartment had ever seen, thick enough to swallow the sound of his own boots. Through the windows at the far end, the city stretched out under a sky that hadn't fully surrendered to evening yet, all steel and glass catching the last gray light. Most of the offices sat empty, doors shut, nameplates gleaming under recessed lighting that probably cost more per fixture than his monthly rent. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. Nobody left to answer it. He worked quickly, quietly, the way he always did, trying to leave no trace that he'd been there at all. That was the job. Move through spaces that belonged to other people and disappear before anyone noticed you'd touched anything. He was almost done when he reached the corner office. Dark wood paneling, a wall of shelves lined with framed photographs and awards he'd never had a reason to look at closely. a heavy desk with a brass nameplate that read, CEO, in letters too clean to be anything but expensive. He'd walked past this door 100 times without ever seeing what was behind it, because the door was always, always shut. Tonight it stood wide open. Joe stopped walking. He knew the rules without anyone spelling them out. You didn't go into a room without checking first. You didn't assume anything about who might still be inside at this hour, on this floor, in an office that belonged to a woman most of the building only spoke about in careful, quiet tones, like they were afraid saying her name too loud might summon her. Amelia Brooks, CEO. The name on badges and letterhead, and the cover of 2 business magazines Joe had seen in the break room. Magazines nobody in maintenance ever got asked their opinion about. He should have knocked, should have called out first, or backed away and come back later, or radioed down and asked somebody with more seniority to handle it. Any of those things would have been the smart move, the careful move, the kind of move a man with a daughter depending on him was supposed to make every single time. Instead, his feet stayed exactly where they were, and his hands stayed on the door. Instead, trash bag still in his hand, he looked up and froze. Amelia Brooks stood a few feet away with her back to the window, white shirt pushed down off both shoulders, hands gripping something wrapped tight around her lower back. Bruising spread up her spine and across her shoulder blades, deep purple against her skin, the kind of damage that didn't come from bumping into furniture. Her hands stayed locked on the brace, like letting go would cost her something. She turned her head first, then the rest of her. For one long second, neither of them moved. The door stood open between them, and there was nowhere left for either one to hide. Joe had no idea that the next 5 seconds would divide his entire life into a before and an after. Nobody moved. Joe's hand was still on the door, trash bag hanging from his other fist, and for a moment his brain refused to process what his eyes were telling him. The CEO of Titan Dynamics stood 8 feet away with her shirt pushed off her shoulders, both hands locked onto some kind of medical brace wrapped around her lower back. Bruising spread up her spine like a map of something that had gone badly wrong months ago and never finished healing. This wasn't a stumble into an empty office. This was a woman caught in the one moment she'd clearly built an entire fortress to avoid. "I'm sorry," Joe said, already stepping backward. "I didn't know anyone was still." "Get out!" Her voice came flat and quiet, which somehow landed harder than shouting would have. She didn't reach for her shirt right away, didn't scramble to cover herself the way most people would have. She just stood there, spine straight despite whatever that brace was holding together, and watched him with an expression Joe couldn't read at all. "I wasn't looking," he said. "I swear I wasn't." "I said get out." Joe backed into the hallway so fast his shoulder clipped the doorframe. He pulled it shut behind him, gently, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't sure you were allowed to acknowledge existed, and stood there in the corridor with his heart slamming against his ribs. Through the frosted glass he could see her shape moving, adjusting something, pulling her shirt back into place. He didn't wait to see more. He grabbed his cart and walked to the elevator faster than his knee wanted to allow, punched the button, and didn't breathe right until the doors closed. By the time he made it to his car in the parking garage, his hands were shaking. He replayed it the entire drive home. The bruising, the brace, the way she hadn't screamed or called security or done any of the things he'd have expected from a woman with that kind of power and that little patience for mistakes. Just 2 words, "Get out." And something in her voice that sounded less like anger and more like exhaustion, like she'd said those words to herself 100 times before she ever said them to him. Mia was already asleep when he got home. Mrs. Okafor met him at the door with a tired smile and a container of leftover stew, and Joe thanked her the way he always did, distracted, his mind still 40 floors up in an office he had no business ever seeing the inside of. He didn't sleep much. He lay in bed running through every possible outcome. Termination first thing in the morning, a call to his supervisor before he even clocked in. Maybe worse, if a woman with her resources decided a janitor who'd seen too much was a liability instead of an accident. He thought about Mia's tuition for the after-school art program. He thought about rent due in 11 days. He thought about the resume he hadn't updated since leaving the army. and how hard it already was to find work that didn't ask too many questions about the gap in his employment history. He thought about the way people talked about Amelia Brooks in the break room, how nobody ever mentioned her being anything other than untouchable, and how none of that had matched the woman he'd seen standing in that office, with her hands shaking against her own back. By 4 in the morning, he'd convinced himself he was already fired. He just hadn't gotten the call yet. He went in anyway. Some habits didn't care what your instincts were telling you. The day shift crew gave him strange looks when he badged into the building that evening, and Joe told himself it was nothing, just tired imagination working overtime. Somebody near the loading dock asked if he'd heard anything about changes coming to the cleaning contract, and Joe just shook his head, too rattled to make conversation. He kept his head down through the first 4 hours of his shift, half expecting security to intercept him at any moment, half expecting his badge to simply stop working the next time he swiped it. Neither happened. Instead, around 10 o'clock, his radio crackled with a voice he didn't recognize. "Mr. Harris?" He clicked it, hesitant. "This is Harris. This is Executive Administration. Ms. Brooks would like to see you. Can you come up to the 40th floor?" Joe's stomach dropped straight through the floor. This was it. Whatever was coming, it was coming now, in person, which somehow felt worse than a phone call or a note left in his locker. He set down his cart, wiped his palms against his uniform pants, and walked to the elevator like a man walking towards something he couldn't outrun even if he wanted to. The ride up felt longer than it had the night before. He watched the numbers climb, 38, 39, 40, and tried to prepare himself for whatever waited on the other side of those doors. Termination paperwork, security escorting him out with a box of his things, maybe even threats about what would happen if he ever spoke a word about what he'd seen. He told himself he could take it. He'd find another job. He always did. He'd figure out rent, figure out Mia's program, figure out all of it the way he always figured out everything, because falling apart wasn't an option available to men in his position. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor, quieter and more polished than anywhere he'd ever cleaned. A woman in a sharp blazer waited for him near the reception desk, expression unreadable, already turning to lead him down the hall before he'd even stepped off. "She's waiting for you," the woman said, gesturing toward a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. "Right this way, Mr. Harris." Joe followed her, every step feeling heavier than the last, his mind circling one single thought on repeat, the same thought that had kept him awake staring at his ceiling until sunrise. Whatever happened behind those doors, his life was never going back to what it was 24 hours ago. The office looked different in full light than it had through a cracked door the night before. Dark wood paneling stretched along one wall, lined with photographs and awards Joe didn't have time to study. Amelia Brooks sat behind her desk, blazer buttoned, posture perfect, nothing about her suggesting the woman he'd seen gripping a brace against her own spine less than 24 hours earlier. If he hadn't witnessed it himself, he might have believed he'd imagined the whole thing. "Mr. Harris," she said, gesturing at the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." Joe sat. His hands found his knees and stayed there, steady, even though nothing inside him felt steady at all. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again, the kind of look that felt like it was cataloging everything about him at once, his posture, his hands, the way he wasn't fidgeting despite clearly wanting to. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for how I spoke to you last night." Joe blinked. Whatever he'd prepared himself for walking through those doors, an apology wasn't on the list. "You don't owe me anything," he said carefully. "I shouldn't have been in there." "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have. But you were. And instead of doing what most people would have done with what you saw, you said nothing. You didn't call anyone. You didn't tell your supervisor. You didn't mention it to a single person on your crew." She tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" Joe considered the question longer than he needed to, because the honest answer felt too simple to be the right one. "Because your private life isn't my business," he said. "Whatever you're dealing with, that's yours. I just came in to empty a trash can." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite warmth, but something close enough to it that Joe noticed. Most people would have sold that story to the first tabloid that offered money, she said. I'm not most people. She almost smiled. Almost. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and then she stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city, the way people did when they were deciding how much truth to hand another person. 6 months ago, I was on a private flight that had an emergency landing, she said, still facing the window. Multiple fractured vertebrae, rib damage, nerve damage that hasn't fully healed and might never fully heal. I've spent every day since then hiding it from my board, from investors, from the press, from almost everyone in this building. Jo stayed quiet, letting her get through it at her own pace. There's a man on my board named Daniel Pierce, she continued, Chief Financial Officer, ambitious, patient. If he knew what you saw last night, he'd have a resignation letter drafted for me before the end of the week, and enough votes lined up to make sure I signed it. We're closing an acquisition in a matter of weeks that determines the future of this company. If anyone believes I'm physically incapable of leading through it, that deal collapses, and so does everything I've spent 15 years building. She turned back to face him. So here's my problem, Mr. Harris. I need someone I can trust completely. Someone outside all of this corporate politics. Someone with no reason to want anything from me except a paycheck he actually earns. Someone disciplined. Someone loyal. Someone who already proved, in the span of about 10 seconds, that he understands the value of keeping his mouth shut. Jo felt his pulse pick up. What exactly are you asking? I'm offering you a position, Executive Logistics Coordinator. You'd manage my schedule, my travel, my day-to-day logistics, and yes, occasionally, things related to my medical situation that require discretion. The salary would be more than triple what you're making now. Full benefits, health care that would cover anything your daughter needs. Jo sat back, stunned into silence. Numbers like that didn't belong in conversations he had, not about himself. You know about my daughter. I looked into your file this morning. Former Army logistics specialist. Honorable discharge. No disciplinary record in 3 years here. A single father. She paused. I don't offer things like this lightly, Mr. Harris. I'm offering it because I think you're exactly the kind of person I can't afford not to have around me right now. Jo's mind raced through everything at once. The money would change everything for Mia. The art program. A better apartment. Real savings for the first time in years. But something in him hesitated too. Some instinct, telling him this world wasn't built for men who clean trash cans for a living. That stepping into it meant risking everything familiar for something he didn't fully understand yet. Why me? He asked. You could hire anyone. Someone with the resume for a job like this. Because resumes don't tell me whether someone can be trusted with something this dangerous, she said. You already proved that. Everyone else in this building would still be talking. Jo looked down at his hands, thinking about Mia asleep at home, about rent, about every sacrifice he'd made just to keep their small life together. This wasn't the plan he'd built for himself, but the plan he'd built had never once accounted for an opportunity like this, walking through a door he wasn't even supposed to open. He thought about her drawing taped to their refrigerator, the one where she'd written, "My dad can fix anything," in crooked purple letters across the bottom, and wondered if this was the kind of thing she meant. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. Something in Amelia's shoulders eased, just slightly, the first sign of relief Jo had seen from her since he'd walked in. Then welcome to a very different job, Mr. Harris. He left her office 20 minutes later with paperwork under his arm and his head spinning faster than it had in years. Outside, the building rose above him into a sky gone dark, its windows lit floor after floor, like the whole structure was breathing. He'd walked into Titan Dynamics that evening as a janitor pushing a cart down empty hallways. Tomorrow, everything about his life was going to look completely different. Sometimes the biggest opportunities don't knock. They quietly wait behind the wrong door. Jo reported for his first day dressed in a suit that still had the tags cut off that morning, the fabric stiff against his shoulders in a way his old uniform never was. A woman from Human Resources handed him a company phone, a set of security credentials, and a folder of paperwork thick enough to double as a doorstop. You'll need to sign the confidentiality agreement before you go up, she said, sliding a pen across the desk. standard for anyone working this close to executive leadership. Joe signed where she pointed, 3 times, his handwriting steadier than he felt. Everything about the morning felt like stepping into someone else's life by mistake, like at any moment somebody was going to tap him on the shoulder and tell him there'd been an error, that the real executive logistics coordinator was on his way, and Joe needed to go back downstairs where he belonged. The elevator to the 40th floor felt different this time, not because anything about it had changed, but because he wasn't riding it with a cart and a bag of trash. He was riding it with a badge that said his name, and a title that still didn't feel like it belonged to him. His first mistake came before lunch. Somebody mentioned the executive dining room, and Joe, having no idea such a thing existed separate from the regular cafeteria, ended up in line behind 2 junior analysts holding trays of food that cost more than his old hourly wage. A man in a tailored suit glanced at him, then at his badge, then smirked in a way that told Joe everything he needed to know about how welcome he actually was. "Wrong floor," the man said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Joe found the right room eventually, quieter. Smaller portions on bigger plates. He ate alone at a table near the window, and told himself it didn't matter what anyone thought, because none of them were paying his rent. Amelia found him during a break between meetings that afternoon, her expression as composed as it had been in her office 2 days earlier. "You're not here to impress people," she said, without preamble. "You're here to solve problems before I notice them. If you're doing your job right, most days I shouldn't need to think about you at all." Joe nodded. It wasn't the warmest welcome he'd ever received, but it was honest, and honest he could work with. Throughout the day, he started noticing things nobody else seemed to catch. The way she gripped the edge of the conference table during a long negotiation call, knuckles pale, jaw set. The way she avoided sitting whenever possible, standing through meetings that clearly would have been more comfortable seated. The way she excused herself between appointments for exactly 4 minutes, never 5, always returning composed enough that nobody watching would have guessed anything was wrong. Joe watched, and said nothing, and filed it all away the same way he used to track supply routes overseas. Small details that meant nothing on their own, but everything together. Across the floor, a man Joe hadn't met yet stood near the glass wall of his own office, watching the same scene from a different angle. Daniel Pierce had a reputation Joe had already heard whispered about twice that morning. Chief financial officer, sharp, political, the kind of man who noticed a sudden promotion the way a hawk noticed movement in tall grass. Daniel didn't approach Joe directly. He simply watched him cross the floor a few times, expression unreadable, filing away his own observations, the way men like him always did. He mentioned nothing to anyone that day, but Joe noticed him noticing, and something about that quiet attention settled uneasily in his stomach. By late afternoon, an important set of documents went missing right before a meeting with 2 international partners. Panic rippled through the room in the particular way it does when executives realize something might make them look unprepared in front of people whose money they needed. Joe remembered seeing the folder earlier, left behind in the room where the pre-meeting briefing had taken place. He retrieved it without announcement, without drawing attention to himself, and simply placed it in front of Amelia's seat moments before the partners walked in. She glanced at it, then at him. She didn't smile, didn't thank him out loud, just gave a single small nod before the meeting began. For a woman who apparently never smiled, Joe understood that nod meant something. The day stretched long past what he was used to, and by the time evening settled over the city, Joe was driving Amelia home in the company car, the 2 of them mostly silent, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as unfamiliar. He caught her in the rearview mirror once, her hand pressed flat against her side, jaw tight, breathing carefully like she was counting something in her head. She caught him watching, and immediately straightened, smoothing her expression back into something unreadable. "Long day," she said, like that explained everything it clearly didn't. Joe didn't push. That wasn't his place yet, maybe not ever. He pulled the car up outside her building, a glass tower rising into a sky gone the color of ash, and stepped out to open her door, the way he'd been instructed during orientation that morning. She stepped out slowly, one hand braced against the door frame. Then her legs gave out beneath her. Joe caught her arm on instinct, steadying her before she hit the pavement, his grip firm enough to hold her weight without hurting her further. For one long moment, neither of them said anything, her hand gripping his forearm hard enough to leave marks, her breathing shallow and controlled, like she was fighting through something Joe couldn't see. She straightened herself the moment she found her footing again, pulling her arm back, smoothing her blazer like nothing had happened at all. "Forget what you almost saw," she said quietly, already walking toward the entrance. Joe stood there in the cooling evening air, watching her disappear through the glass doors, the weight of her arm still fresh against his palm. He knew, standing there, that forgetting wasn't something he was capable of doing. By the end of his second week, Joe had stopped waiting to be told what to do and started anticipating it instead. He learned Amelia's schedule well enough to know which meetings ran long and which ones she'd want an early exit from. He learned to have water waiting on the table during negotiations, ice packs tucked discreetly in the car for the drive home. The elevator held 2 minutes before she needed it, so she wouldn't have to stand in a crowded lobby making small talk with people who didn't know what standing cost her. He learned which hallways had the fewest stairs, which conference rooms had chairs with better support. Small logistics nobody else in the building would have thought twice about. None of it was mentioned out loud. She never thanked him directly, never acknowledged the small adjustments that made her days easier. But Joe noticed the way her shoulders relaxed by a fraction whenever something simply worked the way it needed to, without her having to ask. Their friendship hadn't started yet, but something like trust had. At home, the changes were harder to hide. Mia noticed first, the way kids notice everything adults think they're too young to catch. "Dad," she said one evening, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor while Joe cooked dinner, "you smile more now." Joe laughed, surprised by it. "Do I?" "Yeah. Like, actual smiling, not just the tired kind." He hadn't realized it himself until she said it out loud. Somewhere between the suits and the unfamiliar elevators and the constant pressure of a world he still didn't fully understand, something in him had shifted too. Mia had started telling her classmates that her father worked upstairs now instead of downstairs, proud in a way that made Joe's chest tighten every time he thought about it. "No job is beneath anybody," he reminded her, the same thing he'd told her a dozen times before. "Downstairs or upstairs, work is work." She rolled her eyes the way only an 8-year-old could, but he could tell she'd heard him. The following Tuesday, Joe's phone buzzed during a meeting he couldn't easily step out of, Mia's school. He excused himself as quietly as he could manage, heart already racing through worst-case scenarios before the woman on the other end even finished her sentence. Mia wasn't hurt. She wasn't sick. She'd simply forgotten her science project at home, and the deadline was in an hour. Joe apologized to the room, already calculating how fast he could make the round trip and whether it would cost him this job he'd only just started. Amelia studied him from across the table for a long moment before speaking. "Go," she said simply. "I'll rearrange the next hour." Joe blinked. "Are you sure?" "I said go, Mr. Harris." He made it back with 11 minutes to spare, breathless, project in hand, watching Mia's face light up with relief. He hadn't expected to feel so deeply himself. He thought about Amelia rearranging her schedule without complaint, without making him feel small for needing it, and something about that surprised him more than it probably should have. Across town, Daniel Pierce was doing his own kind of digging. He'd requested Joe's personnel file through channels that didn't officially exist, the kind of favor called in quietly between men who understood the value of information nobody else had access to. What came back told him little on the surface. Former Army logistics specialist. Honorable discharge. Clean record, no disciplinary history, nothing that explained a sudden jump from janitorial staff to executive support. That absence of explanation bothered Daniel more than any scandal would have. Men didn't get promoted 4 floors and 10 times their salary without a reason, and Daniel intended to find out exactly what that reason was. He made a note to keep watching, patient the way he always was, certain that eventually something would slip. That evening, working late on a deal memo that wouldn't stop needing revisions, Amelia asked Joe a question that had nothing to do with logistics. "What made you leave the Army?" Joe considered lying, offering something simpler, something that fit the professional distance they'd maintained since his first day. Instead, he told her the truth. Knee injury during my last deployment. Nothing dramatic, just bad enough that they couldn't clear me for the work anymore. I came home not really knowing what came next, and then Mia's mother passed a year later, and suddenly figuring out what came next wasn't optional. It just had to happen. Amelia didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice carried something Joe hadn't heard from her before. "That explains your discipline," she said. It wasn't much, but from a woman who rationed her words the way other people rationed money, Joe understood it as close to a compliment as he was likely to get. They ended up eating dinner together that night, nothing fancy, just takeout containers spread across her desk while they worked through the last details of a contract neither of them wanted to think about anymore. Conversation stayed minimal, but the silence between bites felt comfortable in a way it hadn't before, less like two strangers forced together and more like two people slowly adjusting to each other's presence. It was during that dinner Joe noticed the fresh bruising along the edge of her collar, darker than what he remembered from before, spreading in a way that told him whatever was healing wasn't healing fast enough. He wondered how long she'd been managing this alone, how many nights she'd sat in this same office with nobody around to notice. He said nothing. That wasn't his place, not yet. But he filed it away, the same way he filed away everything else. The office had emptied out by the time they finished, most of the floor dark except for the light spilling from her doorway. Joe gathered his things, ready to head down for the night, when a sudden crash echoed from somewhere down the hall. He froze for half a second before recognizing exactly where the sound had come from. Amelia's office. Joe dropped what he was holding and ran. Joe found her on the floor beside her desk, one hand braced against the wood, the other locked at an awkward angle behind her back. Not unconscious, not screaming, just frozen in place, teeth clenched, unable to push herself back up. "Lock the door," she said, before he'd even fully processed what he was looking at. Joe turned the lock without question, then crossed the room and knelt beside her. Whatever pride she had left, even now, even like this, was still fighting to keep this contained to the two of them. "What happened?" "The brace jammed," she said through gritted teeth. "It does that sometimes. Usually I can work it loose myself." Joe looked at the mechanism at her lower back, understanding immediately what she meant. The locking clasp had twisted, caught somewhere between positions, and every attempt she'd made to fix it herself had clearly only tightened it further. Something in him settled into the same steady focus he used to rely on overseas, when panic was a luxury nobody on his team could afford. "I need to see it to fix it," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you if I can help it, but this might not feel good for a few seconds." She nodded, jaw tight, and let him work. Joe examined the clasp carefully, found the small lever that had shifted out of place, and eased it back with slow, deliberate pressure. His hands moved with a kind of steadiness that came from years of fixing things that mattered more than they looked. Engines and radios, and once, a jammed rifle mechanism in conditions far worse than this quiet office. Amelia inhaled sharply once, then exhaled as the brace finally released its grip. The relief hit her all at once. Joe watched her shoulders drop, watched months of held tension finally let go, and watched tears slide down her face that she made no effort to explain or apologize for. He looked away, giving her whatever privacy the moment allowed. That mattered more than comfort right now. He understood that instinctively, the same way he understood most things about dignity and what people needed when the walls they'd built finally cracked. "I'm not usually like this," she said quietly, once she'd caught her breath. "You don't have to explain anything to me." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she started talking anyway. "It's not the pain that scares me," she said. "I've lived with pain long enough to manage it. What scares me is what happens if anyone finds out I can't always control my own body anymore. Everything I've built, everyone who works here because I fought for this company to survive, all of it disappears the moment somebody decides I'm replaceable." Joe sat back against the edge of the desk, considering his words carefully before speaking. "My daughter thinks I'm the strongest man alive," he said. "Truth is, some mornings it takes everything I have just to stand up. Knees bad enough some days I have to sit on the edge of the bed and talk myself into it before my feet even hit the floor. She doesn't know that. I make sure of it." Amelia looked at him differently after that, something shifting behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not pity, recognition. While gathering scattered paperwork off the floor, Joe accidentally knocked a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It slipped out before he could catch it, unfolding slightly as it landed near Amelia's foot. She picked it up before he could reach it. A child's drawing. Mia, crayon bright, standing beside a taller figure that could only be Joe, both of them holding hands beneath an enormous yellow sun. Underneath, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, the words, "My dad can fix anything." Amelia studied it for a long moment, something softening in her expression as she looked between the drawing and the man kneeling in front of her. "Does she know how hard you fight for her?" she asked quietly, handing it back. Joe folded it carefully, returning it to his pocket. "She doesn't need to. That's the whole point." Neither of them said much after that. The silence that settled between them felt different than any silence they'd shared before, less like distance and more like understanding. The following morning, Joe found a package waiting on his desk when he arrived. Inside, wrapped carefully, sat a full set of professional art supplies, the kind Mia had circled twice in a catalog months earlier and never mentioned again once she'd seen the price. A small note sat on top, unsigned. "For your daughter's next masterpiece." Joe didn't need a signature to know who'd sent it. He said nothing about it that day, and neither did Amelia, though he caught her watching him from across the office once, her expression unreadable in a way that felt less guarded than usual. Daniel Pierce noticed the package too, walking past Joe's desk on his way to a meeting that afternoon. He noticed something else as well, glancing through the conference room glass to see Amelia watching Joe with an attention that had nothing to do with logistics or scheduling. Daniel had built his entire career on noticing things other people missed, and what he noticed now, standing in that hallway, told him this had stopped being a simple professional arrangement somewhere along the way. He didn't yet know what it had become, but he intended to find out before it cost him anything. That made Joe dangerous in ways Daniel hadn't accounted for yet. Later that evening, alone in his office with the door closed, Daniel picked up his phone and dialed a number he kept for situations exactly like this one. "I want everything you can find on Joe Harris," he said quietly. "Everything. His finances, his background, anything that explains why our CEO suddenly trusts a former janitor more than she trusts her own board." He hung up before waiting for a response, setting the phone down on his desk with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he already knew how this would end. The quiet corporate war that would eventually threaten everything Joe and Amelia had built together had just officially begun. A month into the job, Joe no longer felt like an imposter walking through executive hallways. The suits fit better, though he suspected that had more to do with him than the tailoring. He'd learned which elevators ran fastest, which conference rooms had the best acoustics for difficult calls, and which executives were worth listening to versus which ones just liked the sound of their own voices. But every morning, before any of that mattered, he made Mia breakfast. Walked her to school when his shift allowed it. Checked her homework at the kitchen table, even the subjects he didn't fully remember from his own school days, because showing up mattered more than getting every answer right. "Be kind today," he told her most mornings, the same thing his own mother used to say to him. Mia would roll her eyes exactly the way she always did, but she said it back to him too, every single time, like a small ritual neither of them wanted to break. Those mornings kept him grounded in a world that otherwise threatened to pull him somewhere unfamiliar. Daniel Pierce made his first real move that week, subtle enough that most people wouldn't have noticed unless they were looking for it. Interesting promotion for a janitor, he mentioned to a group of executives during a break in a strategy meeting, his tone light, almost amused. Nothing accusatory, nothing anyone could point to directly, just a small seed planted in exactly the right soil. The comments spread the way comments like that always did, whispered between departments, picked up by people who'd never spoken to Joe directly, but suddenly had opinions about him anyway. A few board members started glancing his way during meetings with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like suspicion. Joe noticed. He always noticed. But he kept his head down and kept doing the work, because reacting to whispers had never solved anything in his experience, only fed them. Amelia's pressure kept mounting as the acquisition entered its final stretch. Investor calls stacked one after another. Government regulators requiring documentation that seemed to multiply overnight. International partners demanding video conferences at hours that made no sense in any single time zone. Joe watched her push through all of it with the same composed exterior she wore like armor, but the cracks were becoming harder to hide from someone paying as close attention as he was. She slept less. He could tell by the emails time-stamped at hours nobody should have been awake. She ate almost nothing during long meetings, pushing food around plates instead of finishing it, and the medication that used to visibly ease her through difficult afternoons seemed to be doing less and less each week. Joe never mentioned any of it directly. That wasn't his place. But he adjusted what he could, quietly, the way he always did. The delegation crisis hit on a Wednesday, arriving 8 hours earlier than anyone had prepared for. A group of international partners, key to finalizing terms on the acquisition, showed up at headquarters expecting transportation, interpreters, and meeting spaces that simply didn't exist yet because the schedule had them landing the following morning. Panic spread through the executive floor fast. Assistants scrambled. 2 senior directors argued over whose responsibility the oversight actually was. Amelia, mid-crisis herself, with 3 other calls demanding her attention, needed someone to simply handle it without needing her to manage the handling. Joe stepped in without being asked. He reorganized security clearance for the unexpected arrivals within 20 minutes, secured 3 interpreters through a service he'd researched weeks earlier, just in case, rearranged 2 conference rooms, and pushed back a lower priority meeting to make space. By the time the delegation walked through the lobby doors, everything looked exactly like it had been planned that way from the beginning. Senior executives who'd barely acknowledged Joe's existence before that day suddenly found reasons to know his name. Daniel watched all of it from his office window, and what he saw troubled him more than any rumor could have. Joe wasn't lucky. He wasn't simply in the right place at the right time. He was genuinely, undeniably good at this, the kind of good that made him valuable, which made him difficult to remove, which made him a problem Daniel needed to solve differently than he'd originally planned. Men who were merely convenient could be replaced without consequence. Men who were competent had to be dealt with more carefully. That night, Joe came home exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor anymore, and everything to do with the mental weight of holding an entire company's crisis together for one afternoon. He found Mia asleep on the couch, homework abandoned halfway through, the art supplies Amelia had sent scattered across the coffee table, where she'd clearly been working on something before sleep won. He carried her to bed the way he had 100 times before, careful not to wake her, and stood in her doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching her breathe steady and even, safe and unaware of everything happening, 4 floors above where her father used to push a cleaning cart. This was why he was doing all of it. Every long day, every unfamiliar hallway, every whispered comment from men who'd never once had to fight for anything the way he had. Across town, in an office that never seemed to fully go dark, Daniel Pierce opened an envelope that had arrived anonymously that afternoon. No return address, no explanation attached. Inside sat a stack of medical invoices, billed under a name he didn't recognize at first glance, connected to a private rehabilitation clinic Daniel had never heard mentioned in any of Titan Dynamics' official records. He read through them twice, slowly, piecing together dates and treatments that started making uncomfortable sense the longer he studied them. He didn't have proof yet, not enough to act on, but it was a start, and starts were all a patient man ever really needed. For the first time since he'd started digging, Daniel Pierce was close enough to the truth that he could practically taste it. Rumors moved through Titan Dynamics, the way water moved through cracked concrete, finding every gap nobody thought to seal. Why does she disappear every afternoon at the same time? Why is the new guy always right there when she does? Something's going on upstairs, and it isn't just business. Nobody had proof of anything. Nobody needed proof for a rumor to spread. Joe caught fragments of it in the break room, in hallway conversations that stopped abruptly when he walked past. In the careful way certain employees avoided his eyes now, instead of ignoring him the way they used to. Daniel Pierce decided it was time to force the issue. He arranged what he framed as a routine audit, a surprise inspection of executive travel records requested through channels that made it look procedural rather than personal. Compliance, he called it. Standard due diligence before the acquisition vote. Nobody questioned a chief financial officer wanting clean books before a major deal closed. What he actually wanted sat buried inside those records. Unusual scheduling patterns. Medical appointments disguised as client meetings. Expenses that didn't match any project on the books. Joe noticed the audit request before it reached anyone else's desk. A small red flag in a routine email chain that most people would have scrolled past without a second thought. He didn't lie about anything. He simply reorganized which documents got pulled first, which meetings got scheduled to overlap with the inspection window, which assistant ended up handling the request instead of someone who might ask uncomfortable questions. It wasn't deception, it was delay. And delay, Joe understood, sometimes mattered more than either truth or lies. He'd learned that lesson long before Titan Dynamics, back when timing alone had been the difference between a mission going smoothly and a mission going wrong. Late that evening, once the office had mostly cleared, Amelia found him finishing paperwork at his desk. "Thank you," she said, without elaborating on what for. Joe looked up. "For what?" "For treating me like a normal person." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, something unusually open in her expression. "Everyone else either fears me or needs something from me. You've never done either." Joe considered that for a moment. "I just work with you." It was a simple sentence, but from the way her shoulders eased when he said it, Joe understood it meant more to her than either of them was likely to admit out loud. The moment didn't last. 2 days later, Joe made the first real mistake of his new position. He overheard Daniel making a comment to a group of junior executives about maintenance staff, something dismissive and cruel dressed up as a joke, the kind of comment men like Daniel made when they assumed nobody who mattered was listening. Joe was listening. "That's not funny," he said, stepping into the conversation before he'd fully decided to. Daniel turned, mild surprise flickering across his face before settling into something colder. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Those people work harder than most of the people in this building, and they don't deserve to be the punchline of your jokes." The exchange grew louder before either of them fully realized how public it had become. Executives nearby stopped pretending not to watch. Someone near the elevator bank actually pulled out a phone before thinking better of it. Daniel smiled, thin and satisfied, the expression of a man who'd just been handed exactly the excuse he needed. "Careful, Mr. Harris," he said quietly. "People are already asking questions about you. This isn't helping your case." Joe walked away before he said something he couldn't take back, but the damage was already done. By the following morning, half the executive floor had heard some version of the confrontation, most of them exaggerated well beyond what had actually happened. Daniel used the momentum immediately. He accelerated his investigation, calling in favors he'd been saving for exactly this kind of moment. Within 48 hours, pieces started falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. Emergency aircraft records from 6 months earlier, buried under confidentiality clauses that had clearly cost someone a great deal of money to maintain. Payments to a private rehabilitation specialist who didn't accept new clients through any conventional channel. A custom medical device manufacturer whose only local client happened to share an address with Titan Dynamics' corporate headquarters. Daniel sat alone in his office that night, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, and finally understood the full shape of what he'd been chasing. Every piece he'd gathered over the past several weeks suddenly clicked into place, like a puzzle that had refused to make sense until this exact moment. Amelia Brooks had been hiding a serious injury for months, an injury severe enough that it explained everything: the strange promotion, the unusual scheduling, the sudden trust extended to a man with no business background whatsoever. This wasn't a scandal about romance or nepotism, the kind of thing Daniel had assumed he was uncovering all along. This was something far more dangerous to Amelia's position, and far more useful to Daniel's ambitions. If the board believed their CEO was physically incapable of leading the company through the most important acquisition in its history, they wouldn't hesitate. They'd remove her before the ink dried on any final agreement. And Daniel intended to make sure removal happened at exactly the right moment to benefit him most. He picked up his phone again, dialed the board secretary's direct line, and requested something rarely called for outside of genuine emergencies: an emergency board meeting, scheduled for the morning before the acquisition vote was set to take place. Enough time to plant doubt, enough time to force a resignation before anyone could stop him, enough time to end everything Amelia Brooks had spent 15 years building, all before she ever stepped foot in the boardroom to defend herself. Daniel leaned back in his chair, satisfied for the first time in weeks, entirely unaware that the woman he was preparing to destroy had already survived far worse than anything he was capable of throwing at her. He had no idea what she'd endured to still be sitting in that corner office at all. The boardroom filled faster than Joe had ever seen it fill before. Board members arrived early, clustered in small groups near the coffee station, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever Amelia's name came up. Investors sat along the far wall, checking phones, checking watches, checking each other's expressions for any hint of what was about to happen. International partners occupied the front row, their presence a reminder of exactly how much rode on the next few hours. Everything Amelia had built over 15 years came down to this single morning. Joe watched her prepare from the doorway of her office, and something about the way she moved told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary presentation. Her color looked wrong, paler than usual beneath her makeup. Her movements carried a stiffness she usually managed to disguise better than this. He'd seen her push through difficult days before, but this felt different, heavier, like she was running on reserves that had already been spent weeks ago. "You don't have to push through this alone," he said quietly. "Yes, I do," she said, adjusting her blazer with hands that weren't quite steady. "This is exactly the kind of day I built this company to survive." Joe didn't argue. He simply followed her into the boardroom, positioning himself near the side entrance, the way he always did, close enough to help if needed, far enough to stay invisible to everyone who mattered in that room. The meeting started calmly enough. Amelia opened with updates on the acquisition timeline, her voice steady despite whatever was happening beneath the surface. Investors nodded along. International partners exchanged approving glances. For a moment, Joe allowed himself to believe this might actually go smoothly. Then Daniel Pierce stood up. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man who'd rehearsed this exact moment more than once. "I think it's important the board understands something relevant to today's discussion." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something significant is about to happen. "There are questions," Daniel continued, "about whether our CEO is currently capable of leading this company through an acquisition of this scale. Questions about her health, her ability to physically perform the demands of this role going forward." Every eye in the room turned toward Amelia. She didn't flinch, didn't react in any way that gave Daniel the satisfaction he was clearly hoping for. She simply looked at him with an expression Joe recognized immediately, the same composed mask she wore through every difficult moment, holding steady through sheer force of will. "I'm not sure what questions you're referring to, Daniel," she said evenly. "Perhaps you'd like to be specific instead of speaking in riddles." Daniel hesitated, clearly not expecting her to call his bluff so directly, without proof laid plainly on the table. Whispers moved through the room, board members glancing between the two of them, waiting to see who would blink first. "I have documentation," Daniel said finally, "that raises legitimate concerns." "Then present it," Amelia said, "or sit down." Joe watched her hold that line, watched the room shift slightly back in her favor, and felt something close to pride settle into his chest. She was winning this. She was actually winning this. Then he saw it. A slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her water glass. A flicker of something crossing her face that had nothing to do with Daniel's accusations, and everything to do with what was happening inside her own body. Joe recognized the signs immediately, the same warning signs from the night she'd collapsed outside her building weeks earlier. She was losing feeling in her leg. Joe's mind moved fast, the way it used to move overseas when seconds mattered more than anything else. If she collapsed here, in front of the entire board, in front of investors and international partners, and Daniel Pierce standing ready to capitalize on exactly this moment, everything she'd built would collapse right alongside her. There would be no recovering from a moment like that, no explanation that could undo what every person in that room would have witnessed with their own eyes. He couldn't let that happen. Joe stepped forward from the side entrance, interrupting the room with a tone of manufactured urgency he'd never used before. "Ms. Brooks, I apologize for the interruption, but there's an urgent operational matter that requires your immediate authorization. It can't wait." The room turned toward him, confused but not suspicious, exactly as Joe had hoped. Amelia caught his eye for half a second, understanding immediately what he was doing. "Excuse me," she said to the board, rising carefully, every movement controlled despite what Joe knew she was fighting through. "This won't take long." The moment the boardroom doors closed behind them, she collapsed. Joe caught her before she hit the floor, easing her down against the wall of the corridor, his training taking over completely now that there was nobody left to perform for. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You never have to apologize for surviving," Joe said quietly. He worked quickly, adjusting the brace, giving her leg time to recover feeling, staying calm the way he always managed to stay calm when everything around him threatened to fall apart. 20 minutes passed before she could stand steadily again, 20 minutes that felt like hours to both of them. When she finally walked back into that boardroom, she looked exactly like the woman who'd walked out of it. Calm, confident, unshaken. Nobody in that room, not the investors, not the international partners, not even Daniel Pierce, ever knew how close everything had come to falling apart in that hallway. She finished the presentation without a single visible crack in her composure. By the time the meeting ended, the board announced their decision without ceremony. The final vote on the acquisition would take place the following morning. Everything Amelia and Joe had fought to protect now came down to a single day, and neither of them knew yet whether it would be enough. Tonight there would be no rest for either of them, only preparation for whatever tomorrow decided to bring. Morning arrived heavier than any morning Joe could remember in a long time. The boardroom filled again, same faces from the day before, same tension humming beneath every handshake and quiet greeting. Daniel Pierce sat near the head of the table, composed, confident, clearly certain the events of yesterday had done exactly what he needed them to do. Amelia walked in exactly on time, dressed in the same deliberate armor she always wore into rooms like this one. Joe took his position near the side entrance, watching her carefully for any sign of what she'd fought through less than 24 hours earlier. If there was anything left, she didn't show it. The vote took less time than Joe expected. Board members spoke briefly, reviewed the final terms of the acquisition, and cast their votes one by one around the table. Daniel watched each vote with growing tension, his confidence visibly cracking as the numbers accumulated in a direction he clearly hadn't anticipated. The acquisition passed. Amelia remained CEO. Daniel's attempt to use yesterday's confrontation against her had backfired in ways he hadn't seen coming. Several board members, rather than questioning Amelia's leadership, had spent the previous evening quietly questioning Daniel's judgment instead. His motives, his timing, the convenient way he'd raised unproven concerns right before a vote that would have benefited enormously from instability at the top. Nobody accused him of anything directly. 3 weeks later, Daniel Pierce submitted his resignation, citing new opportunities elsewhere. No public scandal, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet consequences arriving the way they usually did for men who overplayed their hand and misjudged exactly how much support they actually had. Joe felt no satisfaction watching him go, only relief that the pressure Daniel had built around all of them for months had finally lifted. The months that followed brought changes neither Joe nor Amelia had fully anticipated. Amelia's recovery, slow as it had been, finally started showing real progress. Physical therapy 3 times a week. A rehabilitation specialist who finally had the freedom to treat her without the constant fear of exposure hanging over every appointment. The brace that once controlled her every movement gradually became smaller, then optional, then unnecessary altogether. She still carried the injury with her. Some mornings were harder than others. but the fear that had once defined every part of her life, the fear of being discovered, of being seen as weak, of losing everything she'd built because of something she couldn't control, that fear had finally started to loosen its grip. Joe's own life had transformed just as dramatically, though in ways that felt earned rather than given. His new title arrived without fanfare, but with unmistakable weight: Director of Executive Operations. Unlike the confidential arrangement that had brought him into this world months earlier, this promotion happened publicly, announced during a company-wide meeting, recognized by executives who'd once questioned his presence and now understood exactly why he belonged there. Nobody whispered about him in hallways anymore. Nobody smirked when he walked into rooms that used to feel entirely closed off to men like him. At home, the changes mattered even more. Joe and Mia moved into a new apartment that spring, nothing extravagant, just a 2-bedroom space with better light and a kitchen big enough for both of them to cook together without bumping elbows. Mia got her own room for the first time in her life, walls she immediately covered with drawings made from the art supplies Amelia had sent all those months earlier. She started attending a better school that fall, one with an actual art program instead of the overcrowded classroom she'd been squeezed into before. She joined the school's art club within the first week, coming home every afternoon with new projects, new stories, new confidence that Joe watched grow with a pride he still struggled to put into words. One Friday afternoon, months after the acquisition had closed and life had settled into something resembling normal, Amelia called Joe into her office. She handed him a plain envelope without explanation. Inside, Joe found photographs he didn't remember anyone taking. One showed him from months earlier, pushing his old cleaning cart down an empty hallway, unaware anyone was watching. Another showed him standing beside executives during the acquisition celebration, dressed sharply, completely at ease in a room that once would have intimidated him. "You were never invisible," Amelia said quietly, watching him study the photographs. "We just failed to notice." Joe didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded, folding the photographs carefully and tucking them into his jacket pocket, right next to where he still carried Mia's drawing from all those months ago. That evening, Joe picked Mia up from school the way he did most days now, without rushing, without the exhaustion that used to follow him home after double shifts that left him barely able to keep his eyes open at dinner. "So," Mia said, climbing into the car and buckling her seatbelt without being asked. "Did you have a good day?" Joe smiled, thinking about the envelope in his jacket pocket, about Amelia's quiet words, about everything that had happened since the night he'd accidentally opened the wrong door on the 41st floor. "The best one yet," he said. They stopped for ice cream on the way home, the same small ritual they'd shared since Mia was old enough to hold a cone without dropping it. They sat together on a bench outside the shop, watching people walk past on their way to wherever they were going, nobody among them aware of the story that had unfolded 4 floors above a lobby most of them walked through every single day, without ever looking up. Joe watched the city skyline in the distance, Titan dynamics rising above everything else the way it always had, its windows catching the last light of the afternoon. Months earlier, he'd cleaned those floors hoping nobody would notice him. Now he understood something far more valuable than being seen. Being trusted mattered more. The same office door that once terrified him had become the doorway to a future he never could have imagined for himself or for his daughter, not because luck had found him standing in the right hallway at the right time, but because character had carried him through every moment when the easier choice would have been the wrong one. Mia finished her ice cream and leaned against his shoulder, content in a way Joe intended to protect for as long as he possibly could. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, the same way they'd faced everything else. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.